And this poll is anonymous. This survey is anonymous. We're just going to see the overall numbers, not individual responses. So there are 3 people who haven't responded. Maybe they're doing something else. Or are y'all thinking? Is there anybody who needs more time?
Do you want staff to join in? Because I think we have at least three staff on.
Oh, that's true. Okay, yeah. Please. All right, well, there are 2, no responses, but let's just look at this. So can y'all see that now? Yes, okay. So obviously this is like a very broad question. How has research, what has been the impact of research on you and your community, and how you define research and how you define your community will shape this. But we got a mix of responses. Most people, 45% or plurality, were unsure or mixed, was neutral. And 1% or 9% said harmful, somewhat harmful. 4 people said somewhat beneficial, and 1 said very beneficial. So are there, was this, any reflections on what it was like to think about this question or respond to it?
Hello, thank you for joining us today and for your workshop. Well, it was hard to think of like my community, and I immediately developed like boundaries, and I thought of myself as an English language learner and the research on English language learners in the US. And I said that it has been somewhat harmful because of, but it's not because of the research that has been done, but because of the consequences of that research. And so every time we have a study about how like English language learners lag behind academically and the achievement gap and all that, that gets translated into the idea that they have lower capacity, they effort less than people who do speak English as a first language and so on. And so to me it's like the interpretation of the research instead of a lot of times instead of the data itself. So that's how I answer the question.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Is that Elliot?
Yeah, that's. Can you hear me? Am I very quiet?
It was very quiet. Now we can hear you a little bit.
Is this any better?
Yes.
Okay, good. That happens all the time, and I don't know how to stop it. I'm sorry. But so, yeah, I ended up thinking about my local community, like my city community, Iowa City. And, well, yeah, it was similarly really hard because I think, like, for me, as a white guy, like a lot of research has felt really beneficial. I am like a white trans guy. That's something I'm open to sharing. And so Iowa City is a hub of LGBTQ research. And I know that there's been research that's been like helpful to me, like medically and just in my ability to like live my life. But then I also know Iowa City is a hub of research on the Latinx community in Iowa specifically. And I know that there have been like time and time again, the population groups that are like the study group are like, we're not just like a study group, we're actually like also have expertise to share, and they feel like there's like a lot of extraction of knowledge and not a lot of like real benefit to the community, even though it's stuff that passes IRB. It's still like more holistically extracting stuff from them. So that's why I said like for me, the question was for me and my community. For me, it's been mostly beneficial, but I know that there's a lot of consequences to research that's more extractive instead of like a partnership.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Anybody else? Any reflections based on that question?
Yeah, I thought a lot about just the different actors involved in research, because I see the research that my peers do in the issues that they care about, and of course that is really beneficial because they're pushing for changes that they wish to see, just in their college community and also in their local communities. But then I also see the ways in which research is like there's a lot of gatekeeping involved, and so like when I see like the university administration creating task forces to make all these decisions, and it's a very non-transparent process, then it seems very harmful because there is no trust in that relationship between the people who are making those decisions that are so important and are going to impact thousands of people and like those people themselves. And so it really has everything to do with like who's involved and who's kept in the loop.
Yeah, yeah. So you guys are lifting up really good points about, who does the research, who has access to it, who gets to frame the question, how is it going to be used, how aware are they of how it's going to be used, how does it get spun, and then some of the like methodological questions that also make a difference. How are samples picked, and what kind of bias plays in at each of those stages? And this workshop in participatory action research, and some people call it action research or community engaged research, or there are various terms used. They're all ways of kind of approaching those questions of who's involved and what impact does it have, in a more critical and constructive way. So one more poll. Whoops. I gotta go back. Okay. So this is similar, but slightly different question. See how you want to respond to it. To what extent have you seen your experience and your perspective reflected in research you've been exposed to? Cool, so I'll end this and share it. Can y'all see that? Okay. So 25% said frequently and meaningfully, 50% said sporadically and or superficially, 25% said very rarely, and 0% said never or only in misguided ways. So this is getting more at kind of not just the impact, but the perspective, specifically your voice and your experience and how it's reflected. What was it like to respond to that question? Any reflections on that?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think I kind of misunderstood the question, the first one, and then this one I responded in a different way, because the first one for me is like, of course, for me, doing research has been very beneficial for me, because I didn't think the question was that people was doing research about me or my community. So maybe like right now, when you ask that, I'm guessing then that you're talking about in other researchers, like how if I see myself reflected in other researchers or in research in general. And yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, it depends. If it's here in the US, I don't really see myself reflected at all. But in Colombia, of course, I do a little bit more. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Anybody else?
Share a little bit. My knee-jerk reaction was to answer it based on like academic research and what is often lifted up in a limited way as legitimate research versus other research that's out there where I do think better reflects my experience. So I answered very rarely, but actually that's not true for if I'm considering a broader range of or a broader definition of research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that resonates with me too. When I think about, when I first thought about how I'd respond to this question, I thought of academic research, conventional research, in the way that especially the field of economics has been so ideologically narrow for several decades. It's made like very little intellectual space for research that takes a more critical or social justice oriented type of study of economics. Just as one, you know, one way of thinking about like whether at what perspectives are reflected or not. But then also how the type of kind of participatory action research or community-based research is often you have to kind of go against the grain to do that. It's not incentivized in the university. It's not recognized for tenure and things like that in the same way as just doing a study, conventional study, and getting it published in a journal.
And do you think that that's changing in the last couple of years? Or in some institutions? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you, maybe. I know with in some areas of study, yes, and in some universities, yes. What do you think?
I think it is. I think people who has advocate for that type of research. I can think of Dolores Garcia Bernal, for example, who does testimonios and participatory action research. Or there is one professor in my program, Chris Gutierrez, who also advocate for community-based research, and she has gained recognition with those methods. And so I think there is more space than before. I feel like it used to be much more like settle the line between legitimate, what Nicole said, like validated research and non-validated research. And I think like with the, or maybe it's my bias and it's because I'm exposed to that I feel that there is more space for it. But I feel like this new wave of people working in critical race theory or critical Latinx theory and so on have make up a space for legitimizing this type of investigations. But that's my impression. That's why I was.
I will say that maybe it is, but at the same time, I feel that the way to measure is still, you know, like very much inserted into logics that are very difficult for people that are doing different things. So, for example, if I want to do a video, even though I'm an artist researcher, then that video is not going to count. I have to do a journal and I have to write in a certain way. So that, I think that at least like internationally, that also hurts a lot of intellectual production from the global south. because also the journal and the paper form, I think, is connected to the English language. So, for example, in Spanish, el ensayo is a way to produce knowledge. But then there are a lot of professors back in Colombia that have, I don't know, 4 books published, but they don't have enough points because they haven't produced a journal in a, like certified, in a certified journal that are, a lot of them are in English. So I do think that also like the ways of circulation makes harder to do some kind of creative, like you have to at the end adjust into a certain form. And I think that, close the possibilities of knowledge production.
Yeah.
I also, oh, sorry, I had a quick thought, which is that I think that I've heard, I don't know if this is a just unique thing, but I've heard a lot of people say like, oh, you're just researching yourself, or you're just I've heard it said sort of dismissively, like, yeah, you're researching your own issues, for like faculty of color who are researching, issues of like racial injustice, which kind of ignores the fact that like the majority group is generally researching issues related to the majority group. It's only criticized when it's, members of a marginalized group, but I've heard that a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to share some slides here and present a little bit of some kind of theory and principles, and then a case study, and then discuss that, and then move into a short activity where y'all will try out some of this work. And then we'll close with the final discussion. Let me see if I can share my screen. All right. So this is it's kind of that point I was making a minute ago. In the in the writing on this work, there are different terms people use: participatory action research, community-based participatory research, action research, research justice, and there is nuance, and there's important debates around the framing and the concepts. And the methods. At the heart, though, of each of these, or the kind of like the fundamental distinction they're drawing is that there's one, that there's accountability to in the voices of people with lived experience, that the people who've directly experienced the issue being researched are in decision-making authority over the research itself, and two, that there is an impact beyond just generating new knowledge, that the research intends to change systems that shape the issues being researched, and so it's not just research for research's sake, it's research for impact. And I'm not going to get into the kind of other distinctions between these terms. That's maybe more for a classroom debate, or we could talk about it later. I'm going to get more into the process of doing it. So there are some basic distinctions between conventional research and the type of research we're talking about. Sometimes I just call it transformative research. One, that we're trying to shift power dynamics, and so it's the why. Why are we doing research? Who will do it? Everyday people be involved, and then how it will be done. It is not by sitting in kind of a hypothetically like detached position and theorizing. It will be done through a collaborative process. through a shared decision-making process. And so we're going to talk about what that process is. But sometimes you do have to kind of make the case for this work on research terms. And so especially, you know, if you're trying to get credit for it or have it, you know, recognized by academic institutions or even sometimes by policymakers and the powers that be. And there is research on how these research processes, the benefits of doing this way. And so one is that your validity is strengthened. So there's actually like studies that have found that this type of participation actually strengthens the findings, having them, one, like more buy-in, so there's more people who understand the findings because they've been involved in the research. But two, you've had more perspectives along the way. And so you've actually developed sharper, more accurate findings that you get nuance that you don't otherwise get because people with lived experience have such rich understanding of the topic at play that those insights add nuance to the findings. And conventionally consent in research is very, you know, comes out of the medical model. It's basically, you know, mostly centered around kind of do no harm and informed consent about risks. And so participatory research is a much more ethical approach because it actually asks people to help shape what the goals of the research are, how it will be used, how the findings will be distributed, and other questions. And then that the researcher ourselves are transformed through these relationships and through the journey along the research process. And then besides just kind of producing findings that can be used to do advocacy, there are other areas of impact. So especially in terms of kind of systems of power and building power in the community. So the relationships that are built through the research process and the knowledge that is built through that process, it becomes a form of power, really strengthens community organizing. And then practical skills, project management, you know, how to do a survey, how to make a map, all these different skills that come into play have application in other areas of life. So they're actually professional skills that people can use elsewhere in their life. And then people actually sometimes have great benefit in their personal life through the experience of being involved in participatory research. And that's certainly true in some of the projects I've been involved in that I'll talk about. I'm gonna skip this part. We'll get to it in more real terms. The first kind of important, you know, conceptual framework I wanted to share with y'all for thinking about research is to think about it as popular education. And I don't know if y'all have read Paulo Freire or others who have written about popular education, but you know, it's talking about what is the process from going from a level of awareness where you're really not aware of your own power, of your shared struggle you have with people, of the way that structures affect your life and your community, and moving to a place where you have that heightened awareness and you have a sense of how you can use that power to shape those structures. And so you can think of research not as a process of generating new knowledge for some, you know, as some outcome, but as a learning process that people are going through together. And so a way to kind of think about that abstractly is that you're going from knowing yourself and understanding your own life story, your own conditions, to knowing and having a shared understanding of a collective, whether that's your family or your social group or your research team or a community organization, having a shared analysis of your shared experiences within that collective. And then a broader network, whether that's your community based on your race or age or position otherwise in the community, what that broader community's experiences are, to what is the structural arrangement that is shaping those experiences, and what are the leverage points, what are the areas where you could exert power to shift those structures. And so the whole time you're kind of going back and forth between personal and structural. It's not just kind of a linear process. And it's not like a process you do and then you get done with and you're just enlightened or something. We all know that. But this is one way to kind of reframe how we're thinking about the research process. And then a big part of facilitating participatory research like this is demystifying the research process. Most people hear research and it's kind of like this black box that these experts know about, and they're really smart, and they do these things and they come up with these findings. And that, that really hides power, that really hides access and prevents access. And so kind of unveiling the process and demystifying the research process is key for people to be able to understand, well, what are the decisions involved in the research process, and how do we shape that process, right? So this is a very generic but useful set of 6 steps of designing research, from setting the goals to designing the project, where you're thinking about the methods and the data sources and who will collect the data or the evidence, to the data collection, implementing those methods, to analyzing the data that you gather, and then using it to communicate what you found and what's important, and then evaluating the impact that you've had, and then you can go back to step 1 after that, and it's a kind of cyclical process. But so besides just thinking about research as a popular education, a learning process, we're now thinking about it as like a set of pretty specific decision points, right? And so you map out the decision points, and you can say, well, who's at the table making those decisions? Well, what resources do we need to be informed enough to, really feel confident about making those decisions? Or what barriers exist for people to be able to be meaningfully involved in making those decisions that guide the process. And so this is another way of kind of reframing research, in this case as a decision-making process. So I'm going to get into a quick little case study of a project I was involved in called the Safe Return Project, which is now an independent organization in Richmond, California, made up of formerly incarcerated people who are working toward mass liberation and working to dismantle mass incarceration and working for racial justice. And it started as a participatory research project, and then grew. The kind of the work developed such that then it became its own organization, and the people who we had hired to be the community researchers now lead the organization, staff the organization, and then some of them have moved on. And so it's been a good example to talk about some of the ways that research can build power in pretty specific ways, both in terms of changing policy and in terms of changing the kind of power dynamics in the community. In this case, you know, how people who've been through the criminal justice system are or are not involved in the decisions about how justice is handled, how crime is responded to, how people are treated when they come home from incarceration and other areas of, you know, policy and community. And so Safe Return, you know, the basic model was that in this case, this was led by a couple nonprofits, and we came together and we hired 10 people who had been recently released from incarceration, and then for about a year trained them in community organizing and research methods, and they then carried out as a part of that. I mean, they were doing research and community organizing to learn it, and so there are a couple different types of research that they did, and so I just wanted to kind of name those and talk about how what came out of the different types of research they were doing. There are, you know, there are very different kind of tools as far as like impact that different research methodologies will create for you. So the team did a lot of in-depth interviews of each other, of their contacts, of other people, you know, getting who were just come home. And those in-depth interviews were mostly about building relationships. They were mostly about just connecting with other people who had a similar experience or had been through the system themselves, and then understanding the issues that those people were experiencing and the interests that they had. And so it's kind of a common thing that organizers do. A lot of times organizers don't call this research, but in fact it is research. And then the team did a survey of residents. There was like very little data on the types of challenges people coming home from incarceration were facing. And so the survey was a way to get hard numbers on some of the challenges that the team knew that they personally had experienced. They heard others of their contacts had experienced, but they didn't have the data to back up that was like a widely held experience, a broad, you know, problem. And then they did visits and interviews with service providers and reentry projects. And that was in order to create their own vision for redirecting funding from mass incarceration towards community-based programs. And so those site visits and case studies were used to inform their own plan for proposals for, you know, the alternative system they were trying to advance. And similarly, they used reports on kind of best practices and stuff like that. Oh, and then they actually also, related to those case studies and site visits, they gathered numbers on the program costs so they could create their own alternative budget for funding that community vision, and you know, pulled those numbers from existing programs so that they would be reliable.
Can we interrupt, or you prefer us to
Yeah, sure.
hold questions until you finish?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm trying to visualize the details about the intervention that you're describing, and I'm trying to think, for example, how do you address the problem of unequal like hierarchical positions when still the people that you are training are the trainee, and they are being trained on your methods or on the methods of the institution that is supporting them. Because to me, that naturally end up in an unbalanced relationship between the participants and the trainers. And also, if it will be great, maybe this is too specific, but I was wondering, like in developing the survey that you described, and in identifying all of these situations that you were describing about, like they thinking or of specific situations that happened to them and trying to understand if that's something generalizable. Did they come up with these ideas, like where do those ideas come from? Is it from the trainers that guided the discussion towards that end, or is it from the participants themselves? And like the design of the survey, which questions to ask? Like, I really want to know what's the degree of involvement and participation of the people that's working with you in the project.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, on the second part, you know, they designed the survey instrument and went through like 7 drafts of the survey instrument before they felt good about it being final. And we facilitated those sessions. I would never say that like there isn't bias that enters in, or you know, and obviously power dynamics play in terms of institutional power, racial privilege, class privilege, privilege of credentials and knowledge, etc., all kinds of ways. But you know, we just tried to be transparent about all of that, and you know, be transparent about our interests, about our background and privilege, and address things as they come up. Training, you know, it's a I think training, it depends how it's done. I think, you know, facilitating in a way that is rooted in, you know, principles of popular education and participatory research is really different from a type of training that kind of says, I'm an expert, I'm here to, you know, give you this special knowledge, and you know, you just take it on and then you have it. As kind of banking approach to education. And on the other hand, you know, people were, they knew what they were getting into in this project, and they wanted training. So it wasn't like it wasn't like the training was an imposition. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of context I could get into, but that's what I'd say now about those questions. Any other questions or reflections? Okay. So this is just one example from the survey findings. We found that 78% of previously incarcerated local residents were unemployed. And then we compared that to the overall unemployment rate in the city and the state at that time. And so there was a lot of organizing and advocacy that that used the research and that came out of the research process. This was a time where the state of California was giving counties a lot more authority and money to restructure the criminal justice system. and the sheriff wanted to expand the jail. And so Safe Return led a campaign against that jail expansion and defeated it and got $6 million redirected towards employment, housing, and one-stop reentry center. And then they also got a couple new laws passed at the local level around ban the box, around fair housing, and then banning juvenile fees in the county juvenile justice system. And then there were impacts just on the power in the community. There hadn't been a group of formerly incarcerated residents who were getting to the table to shape policy and to shape public decision making. And now Safe Return is pretty widely recognized and has to be factored in as these types of decisions are made. And so it definitely shifted power around those issues and around who's at the table. And then for some of the people involved, like, this is Clarence Ford, and he doesn't care, he tells this story all the time, but he was one of the original team members and then went on to finish his BA and then got into the Goldman School, did a master's in public policy, and now he works at the Burns Institute doing related work professionally. So obviously this project wasn't the only thing going on, but it was important for him in that, his pathway, just the skills and connections he gained through it. And that's a story he tells pretty regularly. So that's a very short synopsis of a project, and I'll stop there for a minute to see if there are questions or thoughts on that case study. Oh, SROs are school resource officers. Yeah, they're also that type of SRO in housing, but no, they're cops who are at the schools. Yeah, they kind of disingenuously call them school resource officers.
I have another question if there's time.
Yeah, please.
So one of the last parts for kind of the process outlined was about budget, and I'm kind of wondering what that looks like as far as iterations of research. Like, how are you planning ahead of time to accomplish something and then also readjusting your budget as you go? Or what does that look like?
So the budget for the work, like the budget for the research process?
Yeah.
So for this, we didn't know how long it would go or what the policy priorities or opportunities would be towards the end of it. We had raised, everybody involved was at a nonprofit. We didn't have a university partner in this project. This was before I was at Other and Belonging. And so we had raised a grant, we had raised money for 1 year. And by the end of that year, there was a lot of momentum and everybody wanted to continue. And so we kept fundraising, and then we just, kept trying to get new grants to be able to sustain the work. So it was, a lot of, for us, like a really key principle was honoring people's time and honoring, community knowledge as a form of expertise. you know, while a lot of projects, you know, you'll have kind of all these people at the table who are getting paid salaries, and then the like community representatives there not getting paid, even though they're often the ones with the greatest insight. And so we were trying to go against that. And so it did mean more fundraising. We had to raise, you know, more budget, but that was the only way we were really willing to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other thoughts or questions? Really?
I mean, I do have one, but I don't know if it's even a question. It's just like a thought, because in Colombia, this kind of research is very widespread. So even the government does this kind of research. And I know that for what I've talked with some communities, they are like, okay, but like we're tired of research because you come here. We don't care if it's this kind of research or we are participating or not. The thing is like, then we are not getting the other things done. So there are thousands of diagnostics, and I just feel that, yeah, like yeah, it's just a thought, because sometimes, you know, I think that it's easy to legitimize IAP, I mean, yeah, action research, if you compare it to other kinds of research.
Yeah.
How to do accountability and how to do evaluation to the inside, right? Like comparing with similar processes. So yeah, I don't know, this is kind of a question, I don't know, but it's just a thought that I have.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. There's like over in some places and on some issues, there's like oversaturation of research, and that becomes like an avoidance strategy for actually changing the conditions and the problem. So I think that's a really important point. And in some cases, you know, for us, in some cases, our work turns towards the university. So a more recent project we had was focused on what UC Berkeley should be doing to have a positive impact in low-income communities of color in the Bay Area and in Richmond in particular. And so in that research, we were focused on like, well, how does the university's contracting process work? Well, who are the researchers already doing research in Richmond? How does the hiring process work at the university? How are the funds distributed for grants and things like that? And so in that case, the interest was in like focusing on the institution itself. And even though we were positioned at the university, because we had strong relationships in the community, they chose us to partner with them, and we actually got pushback from the chancellor and others for the work that we were doing, because we were providing them with the type of technical and legal assistance that really kind of changed the power dynamic. So sometimes I think the institutional analysis is what's needed, and sometimes it's not. You know, it kind of depends on the moment and the context. Other reflections, thoughts, questions? Okay, cool. So
can I say something, Eli? Just a quick questions. And
please.
I want to wait till give them space. Can you just tell us more from your own personal experience doing this type of research? in terms of length and the energy the researcher put into this type of participatory research versus, you know, doing one on my desktop, how the length of time, energy you spend.
Yeah, it's really different. That's one of the reasons why it's hard to engage summer fellows in this type of work, because 2 months is a very short amount of time, and this work depends on building trusting relationships, and that takes time, and it takes a kind of intensive investment that other types of research don't take, and it also, yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about that next, actually, so maybe I'll just get into that. Because I have these super fancy visuals. Oh, so this was, before I come back to your question, Sadiq, I will in 1 minute. I just wanted to kind of return to that initial framework and connect it with the methods used in the Safe Return project, to kind of make that more clear. So this wasn't all we did, but as a part of the kind of knowledge of self and critical analysis of each of our own positions, we use life maps, the kind of mapping out your life in stages and discussing that as a team. And then moving to shared experiences, the in-depth interviews were really key, members of the team interviewing each other. And then to build a kind of sense of the broader community or networks experiences, the survey was really key for that. And then finally, the policy analysis around county funding, state funding, around the jail expansion, around where around the juvenile fines and fees and other policies. So just some kind of like beginning questions, and you know, questions that are always relevant are what are the policy timelines and opportunities? You don't want to like finish, you know, 6 months of work on this really amazing community vision and budget and then realize that like the agency that could adopt that budget or change that policy, you know, just made the annual decision on its budget, for instance. And so you both have to kind of track, you know, be involved in this flexible process of participatory research, but also be tracking what are the different opportunities for impact, and when are those windows opening and closing, and then what are the existing community organizing processes, right? So not to like come in and start something that that doesn't build on the community's existing networks and leadership and organizations, power structures that already exist there, because that can really kind of fracture and disrupt if you try to just create something new without building with the people who are already there. Data availability, where is it going to come from? What already exists out there? Obviously, capacity, funding, resources, what are you going to need in terms of tools and resources? And then power differentials, both you know, between wherever you're positioned, other organizations, and within the community. Sometimes there are gatekeepers that hold a lot of power but don't have actually have trusting or relationships with that many people, and so understanding those differentials is key too. I'm going to skip forward. So this kind of starts to get at what Sadiq, you were asking, like what this work takes. You really don't know like what type of methods are going to be useful. until you get into the work. And sometimes, and that means that you may have training that's not relevant. And so being flexible, being willing to respond to the process is really key, and being resourceful. And then taking the time to build trust and shared agreements around your shared values and the vision of where this is going, and just build those relationships. And then, like I said, being resourceful. So like being able to, maybe we need to create some maps, but nobody on the team knows how to make maps. So then, I'm gonna find somebody who can work with us in a principled way, who has those skills. To really be well versed in change strategies is pretty key, because it's organized. Working with organizers, they're going to want to know why would we take all the time to do this research? How is it actually going to deliver something of benefit to the organizing process? And so the more that you're aware of what those organizing strategies are, the more specific you can be in strategizing with them about how the research fits with the organizing strategy. And then I guess I kind of said this, but just the technical and research skills that are relevant to the issues being prioritized. And then just some kind of, general tools that are really useful. So a community advisory board, or sometimes called a steering committee or a project team, is the body of people who are governing the research process. And so they may not be doing every piece of the research. Sometimes community groups, they don't want a long drawn out participatory process. They kind of want somebody to go gather some data and bring it back to them. And so sometimes deep participation actually isn't the priority. Impact is the priority, and their participation comes through some other means, like their community organizing process. But that community advisory board is what can make that decision about what the priorities are. And then your principles of collaboration is a written or otherwise kind of documented agreement that everybody has about how you're going to work together, about what your vision is and goals for the work are, what you're going to do if conflicts come up, things like that. And then facilitation skills, facilitating interactive participatory decision making, facilitating workshops. That's relevant throughout. And then curriculum. So just because you know something doesn't mean you can teach it. And so having curriculum and resources on methods guides and other things like that to help people build the capacity and knowledge to carry out the work. And this is something that kind of it relates to your question, El Sadiq. You can I like to say you can choose 2 out of these 3. You can have a process that's participatory and fast, but it won't be rigorous. Or you could have a process that's rigorous and fast, but it won't be participatory. Or you can have a process that's participatory and rigorous, but it won't be fast. So it's a little corny, but I found that to be true. So at this point, I wanted to pause for any questions or reflections on that part, and then get into a short activity. Anybody, anything on your mind? All right, well then let's jump in. So I'm gonna set up breakout groups, maybe maybe 3 of them? Does that sound That'll be like 3 or 4 people. And
Don't count me
we,
in, Eli. Don't count
sorry?
me in. Don't count me in. I have to leave.
Okay. And then I just wanted to medical, and I thought we should pick an issue, participatory research process, and so if anybody has something at the front of your mind, that we could all focus on as like the issue our project's going to focus on. I was thinking police violence, racist police violence, because it's obviously in our minds. How does that sound? Does anybody want to do something different because you're burnt on thinking about that? See some thumbs up. Okay. Okay. If everybody's all right with that, then let's do that one. And then so these are kind of questions to get you started. I'll put them in the chat box. I don't think you'll be able to get through all of them, but let's take 10 minutes or so to think about how you might yeah, there we go. How you might do a project focus on racist police violence with it, using some of this participatory action research frameworks. All right, see you guys in 10 minutes.
Sorry, are we going
Yeah.
to have access to the group chat when we are in our breaking rooms?
What? Sorry, you broke up.
Sorry, are we going to have access to the Zoom group chat when we break into the groups?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Hey everybody.
Hi.
So how was that? Way too short?
Yeah, super quick.
Yeah. Well, what was meaningful about it? What were you wrestling with or focused on?
I think one of the things our group began talking about at the end is the availability of data to even know to know precisely who should be involved in this participatory research. Like, what does it really mean? Because we were talking about like over-policed communities, but do police even keep quality records that would be publicly accessible for us to know who really should be involved? And so that was one of the kind of challenges that we highlighted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. So did you come up with an idea of how you would approach that if you couldn't get information from the police? No?
Our breakout session ended at that point.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that can be hard. I think, I think it's important to think about it in terms of social networks, like not just spatially, but how are people connected who are being over policed, right? So if they're being over policed, then they have some kind of connection to the justice system. And that means that they will physically be at like the courts or the probation office or service providers that serve people coming home from incarceration or people who have been abused by police. So legal services organizations, and then like also kind of social institutions like faith-based institutions, or clubs, or crews. And so then you can start to think about like, well, who are leaders or who do we have connections to, or how would we build a relationship with those networks, right? Like, where do we start in building those trusting relationships?
We talk about how in the reading that you assigned, there was a lot of emphasis on starting with working with groups that are already involved working with these communities.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't start with scratches or from scratches.
Yeah.
So other partnership organizations that are already involved in working with the communities that we want to approach.
Yep. So did you brainstorm who those would be or what that would look like?
For our, I don't know, Gabriela or Dalia, do you wanna? For our, we thought about working with incarcerated communities. And so we would have to find out which organizations are working already with these people that we want to approach, but also one of the key partnerships in our particular case would be the jail community, the like people in the system that would have to give us access to being physically in the jail to interview and to talk and to train and to build relationship.
What were other groups focused on or wrestling with?
In breakout room 3, Elliot brought up a really important point about the like heterogeneity of politics and perspectives within communities. That people may not often agree with each other, even within, like when we name something a community, within that there is obviously difference and diversity. But we thought that perhaps like a solution to that could be to work like backwards from a solution. Like if we're thinking about over policing or police brutality, we say that we have a goal of reducing arrests or instances of police abuse or whatever in a community to 0. And we work from there to think about strategies and tactics that everyone can agree with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that idea. I also think there's value in just being okay with contradictions and disagreement, and moving together through a process through which people become more aware. So, you know, like when we started Safe Return, some of the people involved who are now really radical, like their idea of what they wanted to do was like scared straight stuff, like go out in the hood and tell young people how awful prison was, and then they'd be so scared they'd stay out of trouble. Very different kind of paradigm in politic. And so through the work, you know, they developed a whole different analysis and set of strategies.
How did you deal with that perspective and trying to like honor that perspective from the people who are like involved and have been through the prison system? Maybe while also like having concern, like maybe personal disagreements with that perspective. Like, how do you deal with that?
I mean, we had a whole series of discussions, and the research process itself was like exploring, you know, why, you know, well, first, like why the people in the group, how they had ended up incarcerated to begin with, and their own analysis around how that happened. And then talking to others about that, and then talking to others about what barriers you face coming home from incarceration. And so it wasn't really about like whether I or others involved in the project like agreed or disagreed. It was about, you know, setting out a set of questions, and then a collective inquiry into those questions.
Eli, I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about how you think about setting that framework around a research question. And that's something that we also talked about in our group, trying to get a little bit more specific about what kind of question we'd want to ask. But in your case, like, what was some of the thinking around what kinds of questions to start with?
So we started with a question that was partly informed by like what we knew was going on institutionally and the types of opportunities this community would have to secure resources and change policy. And because it, a lot of that at the time was around reentry and so the county and the state were changing policies and shifting money around related to reentry. And so our framing of the question around like, well, what do people coming home from incarceration really need? What barriers do they face, and what resources do they need? Was partly like a question based on that like institutional opening, and partly based on our kind of definition of the community of wanting to engage people who had been through the system, who could speak directly about how to change that system. So yeah, I don't know how much we had like a kind of a framework, you know, and intentionally thought of it in that way, but looking back, that's I think why we framed the question that way. And then it, you know, that question opened up into many other questions. So I know we're over time, and I'm sure y'all have other stuff to do. Anybody who hasn't talked, do you want to share any closing thoughts or any reflections? Okay. Well, thank you all. I hope you enjoyed this, and appreciate you being involved in this work, and hopefully we'll get to talk more at some point and do some work together.
Thanks for joining us, Eli.
Thank you, Eli.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye.
Take care, y'all.